Good to see you guys that have survived the first purging. And a little like the divided kingdom, the Israelites, the northern ones, have gone off, and we've been left with the Judah crowd, which is a little bit still in David's crowd. So this is a good one, and the others, well, we'll just have to hope to recover them at some point in the future. Yes, they may be lost for a long time. What we're going to be exploring this evening is what I'm calling the common Judaism of the Second Temple period. And in many ways, our understanding of common Judaism of the Second Temple period took a big change in the 1970s. And our understanding of Judaism, there was more of an attempt to understand it from within itself rather than standing outside of it as Christians and judging how they did what they did. There was more of an attempt to understand how it actually functioned from within. And in many ways, when the scholars start to take a kind of paradigm shift, it takes time to get through, because you've got the people at the very top of the scholarship tree who are now writing books in the late 70s and the early 80s about this different way of understanding Judaism. Then that starts to get down to the PhD students and those who are going to become lecturers. And then it gets into the lecturers. Then it starts to get into the pastors, and then it starts to get into churches. But it takes a while. So some of the stuff might be different from what you've heard, but that's just because it takes time to flow through in terms of the understanding of it. So hopefully you'll see why the shift has taken place, and hopefully you'll be able to see some of the implications for that. So what I'm going to start is just talking briefly about why Second Temple Judaism, why it's called that. If you were here last week, if you didn't pass out last week and got all the way to the end, then you may already kind of understand this, but I'll just touch on it again, just to give you that kind of context for what we're looking at. So in terms of Israel moving into the land, that's kind of like the conquest settlement period. It's a time in which the 12 tribes exist alongside each other. There's no real central control. And so it's more a kind of confederation of tribes. And then towards the end of that period, they decide they want a king. First of all, you get King Saul, but then you get King David and then King Solomon. With King David, you kind of begin the kingdom period. And David has plans for building a temple, but God withholds that from him because he's a warrior king. And it goes to Solomon. And Solomon builds the first temple. And the first temple is a thing of magnificence. The whole world is impressed by it. And for that period of time, with Solomon building the temple and people coming to Jerusalem to see it and to listen to the wisdom of Solomon, Israel is kind of at a high point. And that high point kind of, if you remember, kind of drops away as the different kings are less and less faithful, and prophets come up and they challenge the kings, and some kings will get better and some kings won't. And you end up first losing the tribes in Israel, the 10 tribes, when they're sent into exile. And then finally, Judah itself is sent into exile in 586 BCE. And at that point, It's the end of the first temple period. So the second temple period kind of picks up when they get back from Babylon and they build a second temple. Not nearly as impressive as the first temple, but a temple. But even in this period of a new temple, they're not at the stage of the previous first temple, because while they have a temple again, they don't have their own real authority. They're under the under the control of foreign nations, from all the way from that period of return from exile all the way through to the time of Jesus, except for a small period when they have a little bit of independence themselves. But basically, Second Temple is a little disappointing in terms of has God restored the nation. And some think, this is going well. Others think less of it. They have the period of trouble with Antiochus IV. But surprisingly, things start to look up when King Herod the Great builds them a new Second Temple. The Second Temple, you can't change the dimensions of the actual temple. What you can do is improve all the stuff around it. And Herod does great things. He uses white marble with gold leaf on the outside. So it sparkles in the sun. It's all magnificent. And it's great. Except Herod isn't even a real Jew. I mean, he's certainly not a real son of David, king of Israel. So now you've got a new temple. Things are looking, maybe it's even as great as the first temple in terms of its look, but is God really pleased with it when it was put together by Herod rather than by someone like David or Solomon? It's a kind of hard time. But the questions that they're wrestling with in terms of, is God pleased with this temple? Is this the way, have we returned from exile? Are we finding the blessings of God? Where is God at work in the life of Israel? All those questions are the questions that surround Jesus. And they're very much inherent to the Second Temple period. And the Second Temple period lasts until the destruction of the temple in 70. That's about 40 years after Jesus. And with the destruction of the temple, you then move from Second Temple Judaism into what is usually called Rabbinic Judaism, which Rabbinic Judaism is the kind of Judaism that most of us will be familiar with. If you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, Rabbinic Judaism, you kind of know a bit about that. But it's the Second Temple period stands as this in-between time. And it's a time when Judaism is trying to understand where God is at, but even where they are at. I mean, what does it mean to be Jews in a world in which Rome is controlling things? If the temple is run by people who are collaborating with Rome, is it a real temple? All those kind of questions. So the Second Temple period is a very distinct period, and that's the period in which we get the New Testament and we get Jesus. And so this is the kind of context of Jesus. So we talk about Second Temple Judaism, Second Temple Jews, but the word for Jews isn't in the New Testament, isn't in the writings, because Jews is an English word, and they weren't speaking English yet. They had yet to elevate to that level. They were speaking Greek, by and large, and so the word is iodios, I've got that written down there in the middle of page 2. Iodius. But the trick here is, how do you translate that? Do you translate it as Jew, or do you translate it as Judean? Now, if you hear the word Jew, you usually think of religion, a Jewish religion. If you hear Judean, you tend to think of somebody who lives in Judah and Judea. So is it making a reference to people who live in Judea, or is it making a reference to Jews as a religion? Now, it's a trick question, because in the Second Temple Judaism period, there is no distinction between being from an area and being religious. If you were Roman, you had Roman gods. If you were Greek, you had Greek gods. If you were Persian, you had Persian gods. If you were Jewish, you had a Jewish god. The distinction that we make, where religion is a kind of personal choice, wasn't in that world. And so by and large, if you were from Judea, you were Jewish, with the possible exception of aliens and strangers. So it is possible to live in Judea and not be Jewish. But by and large, when we're talking about Jews, we're talking really about people who live in Judea, but who are children of Abraham. So not the foreigners who are clearly foreigners, and aliens and strangers in the biblical kind of language. So what we're talking about is not necessarily people who have a personal religion, like we have a personal religion, but people who have a national religion, and they're part of that. And so this will get into one of the questions in the kind of period that we're looking at, is what does it mean to be Jewish? Do you have to be particularly religious? How unreligious do you have to be in order to stop being Jewish? And it's a question that we'll return to a few times. But think of it in terms of the argument that we have over un-Australian. What does it mean to be un-Australian? We can think of some things that are un-Australian, like King Charles. And all that was a political comment. I take it back. No, I take it back. But see, we could argue over what is un-Australian, but in the end, nobody gets to decide who isn't Australian, right? I mean, we're all Australians. And in first century world, some people might say you're not very Jewish, but really it doesn't matter because you are Jewish. Nobody gets to decide that. There's no church membership, there's no synagogue membership or temple membership that qualifies you. Everybody is Jewish. In some ways, you don't have to be particularly religious. In other ways, just being Jewish is kind of religious in and of itself. So there's a lot of kind of uncertainty over what it means to be Jewish. At the time of Antiochus IV, when he was trying to stamp out Judaism and highlight or bring in Hellenism, Greek culture, some Judeans, held back and were less and less Jewish in their practices. Did that stop them being Jewish? Well, according to some Jews, it did, but they don't get to decide. Everybody kind of, so it's like you get into that argument. What does a real Jew look like? What do you have to do in order to be Jewish?
So you're related to your family, your mother and father, if they're Jewish?
Yes. So that's like being Judean, right? I mean, that's it. But your family might not be very religious. Right? So when we use the word Jew, we often think of it in religious terms. But it doesn't have to be. You could be Judean and Jewish without being particularly religious. What does it mean to be a religious Jew? And how does that differ? Did you have to go to the temple Passover festival? Many Jews did, but not all Jews did. And some in the diaspora never made it to it. Were they Jewish? Yes. Some Jews regularly went to synagogue and studied Torah. They were Jewish. But what about the Jews that didn't go to synagogue and study Torah? Were they Jewish? Yeah. So there's a fair kind of spectrum of uncertainty in terms of identity. There's a very broad way of understanding it, and then some of the groups had a very narrow way of understanding it. What we're going to be talking about tonight is the broad range of understanding it, and next week we'll look at some of the narrower ways. So Essenes and Pharisees and sinners. Who are those people? Why are they called that? So what's the narrower understanding involved in that? But what is a Jew? By and large, Jews were recognizable only by some of their exterior practices. There wasn't a doctrinal test to being Jewish. We know there's a difference between Baptists and Lutherans and Catholics and Orthodox and stuff. We know there's lots of doctrinal differences there. But Judaism wasn't that kind of doctrinal-based religion. It was based around that ethnicity, the belonging to Abraham and being a child of the covenant. So all the boys were circumcised. And if you wanted as a male to convert to Judaism, almost everybody agreed that you needed to be circumcised. There was some argument about it, but by and large, almost everybody agreed that you needed to be circumcised. And if you were a female and wanted to be converted, there were almost no rules for that. It was possibly because in the culture, it would be the husband or the man that would do that. Some women are identified as God-fearers, perhaps associated with synagogues or whatever, but it's harder to tell. Except if you read the great romance of the 2nd century BCE, written in Greek but set in Egypt. It's the story of Joseph and his wife. There is one verse in Genesis that tells you who Joseph married. Do we know? I'll give you a name, Asenath.
Yes, the princess of the
Her father was a priest. She was a daughter of an Egyptian priest. Now tell me, what is a hero, a patriarch of Judaism doing, marrying the daughter of an Egyptian priest? Missionary dating. Well, Genesis doesn't bother to answer the question, but there's a whole book written in the 2nd century that tells us that Joseph was too holy, too righteous to fall for a foreign woman, and she was in love with him, and so she went through a period of confession and purification, ate honeycomb, and God accepted her, and so in the end, it turns out that it was okay for Joseph to marry her because he became a good Jewish girl. But that book, Joseph and Asenath, which is a really interesting story to read, but that story is told because they have an unanswered question. How do you get a foreign woman into the people of God? It's unclear. It happened occasionally, I mean, obviously, but by and large, there was no rules for that kind of thing.
Ruth was a foreign woman.
Yes, yeah, she was accepted. So there were a few Gentile women in Jesus's history, but no clear way of understanding. I mean, they were kind of they became Jews by marriage, effectively. But see, there's no real behavior requirements for being Jews in that sense. Like, we know that if you want to convert to Christianity, you have to adopt certain beliefs and certain practices. But because the essence of being Jewish is your family relationship to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because of the patriarchs, how do you move from one ethnicity into another ethnicity? So the mindset of what it means to be religious is different. And we have to, what I'm trying to say is that we have to try and set aside our mentality of what it means to be religious when we try and go back into the New Testament world and enter into a very different way of being religious. But commonly, if you were Jewish, you wouldn't eat pork. That's unclean, which was a common meat in the ancient world. But if you lived in Judea, yeah, it was fairly simple because your local butcher wasn't selling you pork. Anyway, so you were kind of religious without needing to be religious. It was just the practice. Everybody would have circumcised their sons. They kept Sabbath, honored the Sabbath, but what did that mean? I don't think, this comes a bit later, but I don't think it means that everybody's at synagogue on Saturday morning reading Torah, because the synagogues that we have aren't big enough for everybody. There's no cathedrals. There's just, they're like the synagogue in Nazareth is about this size. And so you might get your 40, 60 people in there, but Nazareth was a much bigger village, town than that. So where did everybody else go? Well, maybe they didn't. So we don't, I guess in a sense, we don't want to project too much religion into it. There's a sense of just being Jewish. And this is the kind of context in which Jesus finds himself in. I've kind of said this, but Jews share a common story, shared allegiance to the temple. They observe ritual purity. They honor the Torah. But they all share that. But then they have the different groups that we'll look at next week have different interpretations of what that means and what the implications of that is. So it's possible to talk about Judaism, and it's possible to talk about Judaisms, but the Judaism, the common sense, is bigger than the divisions. So there's a big difference between Pharisees and Essenes, but they have more in common than they have apart. Right? All right, so that's just kind of broad. Yes?
So if they, if you were studying the Torah
Yeah.
and memorized it, you were probably a much more educated person then.
If you were reading, yes.
Because if they were not going on
Yes.
to the general average person
Yes.
like myself,
Yeah.
would not have had an opportunity to go sit under the
Yes.
teaching of
Yes, well, you certainly wouldn't because you're female.
yes.
So there would be limitations on that. But by and large, it's really disputed in terms of percentages and whatever, but commonly I think people say 10 to 15% of the population are literate. So that's 85% to 90% illiterate. Now, not totally illiterate in that, they can maybe use contracts or stuff like that, but illiterate in the sense of they're not reading Torah. And so, yes, to actually be reading Torah and studying Torah is a kind of elevated social position.
Because it's almost like Jesus had an expectation that you would know the law and the Torah, so that would be growing up orally.
Yes, hearing it. Yes, hearing it and repeated. The stories would be repeated, and Passover was important because that's where you learn the story of Exodus. The other festival, which what am I thinking? Booths, the Festival of Booths, tells the story of being in the wilderness, and so they learn the stories. And then you have scribes who are the literate ones, and you hear the reading of Torah in synagogue. So you hear those stuff, but you have the group of people who are kind of specialists in interpreting it. So in the New Testament, whenever you see the term lawyer, you should just put a line through there, because it's not talking about lawyers. It's talking about people who study Torah, so Bible scholars. So the bad lawyers in the New Testament are not bad lawyers, they're bad Bible scholars, which I always took more personally. I don't mind talking about bad lawyers, but when I'm talking about bad Bible students, that gets a bit different. So yeah, so there's... So it's a more lived religion. I guess that's what I'm trying to convey here. It's a lived religion rather than a head focus. There's some argument that the Apostle Paul is the first one to invent theology, trying to debate what God is doing and how he does it, whereas usually it's more about the focus is on practice, what are we meant to do. Paul's exploring some of the background. I'll talk to you about it later, but yes, it's true. All right, so in terms of, I want you to kind of try and get yourself into the period where you are, if you live in Nazareth, Jesus' family traveled down to Jerusalem for the festivals, the Passover. And so you have some families who are very engaged in that, and you've got Jesus' aunt and uncle. His uncle's a priest who serves in the Jerusalem temple. So you've got some families that are quite connected in, and then other families who might never make the trip down to Jerusalem because you're subsistence livers. You don't have holidays. You don't have necessarily resources to make that kind of trip and leave your land and all the kind of things that go with it. So it's a kind of what's important is the temple is there, and the priests are doing their work, rather than the fact that you get to there. Because if you get to there, it still doesn't really make any difference. You see the temple and whatever, but if you're a woman, you can't get past the court of the women. If you're male, you can't get into the court of the priests. So it's not you're kind of an observer, but you can participate in it by how you choose to do some of your practices. And so Pharisees choose to practice in a very distinctive way that we'll look at next week. but it's not necessarily like modern Judaism or modern Christianity. It's a different way of being religion. So I just want to kind of remind you about the temple. I've got a picture there of the temple that comes from the model that they've built in Jerusalem. And if you haven't been to Jerusalem, you should go and see this model because it is. But I do have a link in the notes that you can use to find it on a video on YouTube showing you the model. But that is just the close-up of the temple. And what you see at the on the outside of the picture is houses and stuff. So the size of the temple is enormous and has a kind of power to it. The temple is the center of the Jewish conceptual world. So how do you get a temple in the ancient world? And this is true for all Greco-Roman religion in general. Let me talk about that first. Is that first of all, somebody has an encounter with a god, and they build a little stone kind of altar kind of thing, a marker. And you read about those kind of markers in the Old Testament when Jacob wrestled with the angel and stuff as a marker. And so that is seen to be as a holy place. And then you kind of, you build an altar because that's where you meet with a god. And then you build a temple around there so that God can turn up. It kind of expands from that kind of, it's a place of encounter with a god. The Jerusalem temple is a little different in that it was picked for David got the location from God, and it was an attempt to kind of centralize the religion. You've got a central temple rather than lots of different places where people encounter. It means that there's a clearer single focus. There's a priesthood that's responsible for that. But it shares with Greco-Roman concept the idea that this is a place you meet with God. And the Jerusalem temple says there is one particular place in the whole world where if you want to meet the Lord of the whole earth, you know he's going to be there. He will be in the Jerusalem temple. They don't think God is locked inside the Jerusalem temple. They know that God is the God of the whole earth and that he's in heaven and can be found across the earth. But this is the place where he is guaranteed to meet with you. And this is a place where they do their sacrifices. Unlike other religions, Judaism has that central place for doing that. So if you wanted a sacrifice made, then you went up to the temple and arranged for that. But the priests were the only ones who were able to actually conduct that. So the priests are controlling access to God. If you studied really hard and were a good person, you still couldn't get further. You still couldn't get closer to God than if you were a ratbag priest, because the priest had the authority to run the temple. So access to the temple is in the hands of the priests and ultimately the high priest. Now, if the high priest is compromising with the Romans, does that mean that the temple is no longer, does God leave the temple? There are some groups who thought that God had abandoned the Jerusalem temple, but almost wholly in Judaism, the temple was still seen as a place where God dwelt. And the sacrifices, the temple tax, everything was centered around the temple. And I want to pick that up in just a moment. But the key of the temple is that God dwells in the midst of his people in the temple. So on the top of page 5, I have my favorite diagram for this. Yahweh is Lord of the whole earth, but he promises to meet you in one place, and he promises to meet you in the Jerusalem temple. And that makes the Jerusalem temple, the Holy of Holies, the center of the world. And that's the holiest place in the world because that's where God is. And the temple area around the Holy of Holies is holy. And the courtyard around that is holy, but less holy. And the temple precinct around that is holy, but less holy. And the city of Jerusalem is holy. And the land of Israel is holy. Holiness spreads out. And so in temple religion, where holiness is spreading out from the Holy of Holies, it means that purity, your requirement to be pure, governs your access to be able to get to God. Right? And so if you were a Gentile, you couldn't get past the outer area of the temple because you were impure, unholy. If you were an Israelite female, you could get a little closer, but you couldn't get to God because you were impure. If you were menstruating, you wouldn't have even got in that far. You had, but if you the right time of the month, you could get in a bit closer. If you were a Jewish male, you could get further in. But even if you were a respected scholar, even if you were a pious Pharisee, you couldn't get any further than if you were just regular kind of thing, because the purity code determined where you were in the setup. So Jesus couldn't get all the way in because he was of the tribe of Judah, son of David, and not a priest. So it didn't really matter. So temple religion creates a purity code practice that separates itself out from morality or piety or study. Right? So Pharisees, even if they were very righteous, weren't priests and couldn't get any closer. So temple religion is different from our experience of religion, in which individual piety and faithfulness, righteousness, or whatever are seen to be available to everyone who can approach God. But it doesn't. It's different in a temple-based religion. Right, so, but if you lived in Galilee and you weren't going to the temple, you didn't really need to worry too much about purity. I mean, you did the general kind of thing, stay away from Gentiles and whatever. But you didn't need to worry about it too much, because purity only applied in terms of going to the temple. Some Jewish groups tried to live as if they were priests and tried to be pure all the time, but it wasn't actually a requirement of Judaism, and that you would do that. And the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies and made sacrifice for Israel, that forgiveness became available to all Israelites. Yeah?
Well, I listened to Bible Project,
Yes?
so
Yes.
that's been doing the tour.
Yes.
How come the fact that they no longer had the Ark of the Covenant, which centuries ago has gone lost, did not break their speed? Because that was really the place where the atonement happened.
Because the second temple, Holy of Holies, was empty.
Yeah, so how did they get around this big piece of
They just carried on as that was there.
Essentially, but it's about the presence of God. And they were assured in the dedication of the second temple that God had turned up. And so if you read the story of the dedication of the second temple, God turns up. In the same way he turned up for the the Solomon's temple, the same way he turned up for the tabernacle and stuff like that, God had turned up. So the actual specifics, it wasn't magic in the sense of tied to a particular object, but it was a sense of presence. And God's presence was seen to be there, which is why when it was defiled by Antiochus IV, it created great stress, because for 3 years God couldn't dwell in a defiled Jerusalem temple, and so that led to revolution. Now, at the end of the Second Temple period, the temple is destroyed, and so we move to Rabbinic Judaism. But Rabbinic Judaism is continuous with the Second Temple period, but it's not the same. And the difference is the missing temple. And so they shift the sense of God's presence from the temple to the experience of reading Torah. So it shifts. But in Jesus' time, God is in the temple and that's where, and so people who were excluded from the temple or couldn't get to the temple were being excluded from God. And so that's part of what Jesus does differently in terms of providing access to people. Yeah. And so it's a different concept. I mean, we might say Jesus was the most holy person in the world, but it doesn't really count because, yeah.
He wasn't a Levite.
Yeah.
The issue was resolved after the crucifixion when the veil to the temple was split. Top to bottom.
Yeah, or even more before that, when Jesus identified himself with the temple, Jesus became Jesus became the traveling presence of God, and yeah.
So up to that point in time, it was still the Levites that became the priests, so they kept that.
Yes. Yeah. So you couldn't study to be a priest. Your dad had to be a priest. Yeah. And so no Scottish class working boy could aspire to be a priest. But you could be a Pharisee if you really cared. So I came pretty good at that. But that's next week. All right, so we were on page 6 there with the ritual practice associated with the temple, defining the purity things, the purity levels. Jesus would have observed ritual purity. That would have been expected of all Jewish males. And Jesus would have gone through the mikvah, the ritual bath, before going into the temple as part of the purification process with that. But the actual specifics of what you eat and don't eat and stuff like that, that was a little, biblically it's more associated with priests, what they should eat before they go into the temple. If you weren't a priest, well, it didn't really matter. But if you wanted to recognize Israel as a kingdom of priests, well, then it did matter to you. But that's, again, part of the to and fro of the different Judaisms, the different groups within Judaism. So the temple was the central kind of place of meeting God, of receiving your forgiveness, access to God. But the Torah was an opportunity to live a life of faithfulness as best you could, recognizing various commands and instructions within Torah. Now, some of the Torah instructions didn't apply to settled life in Judea. They were part of the wilderness story and traveling and stuff, but some of it did. They argued over whether or not you had to keep exactly what was said in the Torah, or whether or not you should adapt it to modern, contemporary life. The Pharisees were among those who said we should adapt it. So they had oral tradition to help them get from the written law to current practice, much like evangelicals who there's no law about television in the Bible, but when I was growing up, there were plenty of laws in church about what you could or shouldn't do with television by taking biblical things and instructions and interpreting them in a way that applies.
Modern Judaism, you turn the light switch on and do the fire.
Yeah, and ancient Jews would light Sabbath lamps that would burn the whole time. And so that's one of the ways you knew you were going into a Jewish neighborhood, because it smelled of all the burning oil lamps. The Romans didn't like that, but that was part of it. All right, so Torah was a way of trying to be faithful, but this I want to hit on pretty strongly. If you only remember one thing from tonight, it will be Judaism is not a legalistic religion for a couple of reasons. One of them is that legalism is not conceptually possible in first century Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, because the concept of law is a Western kind of concept and abstraction, Greco-Roman kind of understanding of law. But Torah is translated into Greek as nomos. Nomos is translated into English as law. And what happens is you take a very Jewish concept of relationship and the obligations of relationship, turn it into the abstraction of a written law that you follow, and then comes into our language as law. Nomos comes into our language as law. And we have this idea that if you keep impersonal law, that somehow this will, could earn you salvation. But for the Jew, you had salvation, whatever we mean by that. But you had salvation because you were Jews, and you kept Torah because that was relationship. That's what God wanted you from that relationship. So you didn't. You couldn't. If you were Gentile and kept old Torah, you still wouldn't be Jewish because you're not a. Or convert through circumcision. Yeah. So there are some people associated, some Gentiles associated with synagogues who might be called God-fearers. That's a a term that means many things. But some of them would be God-fearers, but they wouldn't be Jews because they hadn't been circumcised. But if you were circumcised, you were fully Jewish, and if you didn't keep, and you were expected to keep Torah, but if you didn't keep Torah, that didn't undo the fact that you were now Jewish. You were now a son of Abraham. So keeping the law never saved you, couldn't save you. It's probably a Reformation. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church got itself into a situation where almost everything was monetized. And so you could kind of, you could end up buying your way into salvation and out of purgatory. But it became it was influenced by a Western understanding of law, keeping the law, keeping God's approval, kind of thing. And so in the time of the Reformation, the Catholic Church was legalistic. And most of the Protestant reformers looked at the Catholic Church and thought they were looking at Second Temple Judaism. And so they just assumed that that was the same problem. In the 1970s, it was finally agreed that that had been a mistake, that we should actually go back and look at first century Judaism on its own terms and not confusing with 15th century, 16th century Catholics. And so that changed a lot of the discussion. But not legalism. And this is important to me because it was totally different from the church I grew up in. The church I grew up in believed that it didn't matter what you do, only mattered what you believed. And so it was a religion of faith. And by faith they meant a set of doctrines. And so if you believed this, you were safe by faith, and it didn't matter what you do. Now, we wanted to be holy, but it didn't really matter because that was works righteousness. We didn't do that. We just did faith, which was a problem, I thought, because Jesus wasn't very good at it. He didn't play that game. When they asked Jesus, "What must I do to be saved?" he didn't say, "Hey, is that a trick? You don't do anything to get saved. You just believe. You just believe, and if you believe, then you're saved." But Jesus said, well, what's written in the law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And at the end he says, go and do. So in the church I grew up in, Jesus was kind of shunted to the side because he didn't quite understand salvation by faith, and we focused on Paul. But that was because we had misunderstood Jesus and certainly misunderstood Paul, but we thought we had a faith-based religion. But it was a false dichotomy, false thing, because the Jews were never works-based. They were always relationship-based. And we are relationship-based. And if it's relationship-based, you can't enter into a relationship and then just ignore it. So you have to live the relationship. So it's not just what you believe in your head, it's the relationship that you enter into which has consequences. So Jesus says stuff like, by your fruit you will be known. Not your fruit will save you, but if you're in relationship, you'll have fruit.
Jesus said he came not to do away with the law, but to fulfill the law. And then you look at his commandment to love your neighbour, etc. yourself.
Yeah. But as you read through the Sermon on the Mount, it gets a lot harder.
But again, he's dealing with his view of the law. He's saying, there's the law, and this is...
It has been said.
Modern law, if you like. Blessed be
Yeah.
those who actually do.
Yeah.
Because of.
Yeah. But so for Jesus, because he was a Second Temple Jew, he didn't have this believe versus do kind of dichotomy. He had a relationship, therefore do kind of thing. And in New Testament studies, that's called covenantal nomism. Covenantal because it belongs to the covenant of Abraham, and nomism is because you then keep Torah. You then live out that relationship. Covenantal nomism. Covenant before law. There are still parts of the church, and I won't name them. I shouldn't name them. And if they ever see this, they'll be very unhappy. Who still want to insist that Judaism was a religion of works, because they want modern Christianity to be the opposite of that. And it should only be by faith, not by works. But it's a misunderstanding of Jesus, and I think it leads to a misunderstanding of contemporary Christianity when we get caught in that. But I'll circle back to that, I think, but before we get to the end. Now, I wanted to say that one of the things that it's difficult to identify is Jesus' critique of Judaism. Jesus wasn't unhappy with Judaism broadly. He spoke well of the temple, but he had more things to say about it. He spoke well of Torah, about the need for the righteousness. Your righteousness needs to exceed that of the Pharisees. So he spoke well the Torah, while at the same time saying that you needed to get to the heart of what God was calling you to be and do. So Jesus didn't criticize Judaism because it was a work-based religion. What he did was try to engage with its understanding of where God was and what God was doing and what time it was in terms of the coming day of the Lord. But when you, what I want to do here, I think I'll try this, is if you go to the very back page, page 12, there we go, it's not in the middle of my pack. This is the 18 benedictions. There's two kind of standard prayers in Second Temple Judaism. The first is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one, from Deuteronomy and Numbers and stuff, and I've got the details there. So that prayer, which we know from, it's very well known to us as well, would be prayed in the morning and the evening. And Jesus would have prayed the Shema. So that's straight out of Scripture. But there was also what they call the 18 benedictions. And these are here. Now, the 18 benedictions were not written down until after Jesus' time. However, when it was written down, it wasn't newly written. They were taking the oral prayers and putting it into writing. So there's not 100% guarantee that Jesus would have used these exact words, because that's not necessarily the exact form it had at the time of Jesus. But there's a high probability that Jesus was saying these prayers on a daily basis. Right? So I'm going to read each benediction, and then at the end you'll see there's a bit in italics, and I'll get you to say that. And what I want you to think of is there anything in this prayer that I think is inherently not Christian? Is there some kind of difference to what the Jewish Jesus was praying and what the Christian followers of Jesus might pray? All right? So, blessed are you, Lord God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, great, mighty, and fearful God, most high God who created heaven and earth, our shield and the shield of our fathers, our trust in every generation. You are mighty, humbling the proud, strong and judging the violent. You live forever and raise the dead. You blow the wind and bring down the dew. You provide for the living and make the dead alive. In an instant, you causes our salvation to spring forth. You are holy, and your name is awesome. And beside you there is no God. Grant us, our Father, the knowledge and discernment that comes from thy Torah. Lead us back, Lord, to you, and we shall repent. Renew our days of old. Forgive us, our Father, for we have sinned against you. Wipe out and remove our evil deeds from before your eyes, for your mercies are many. Look on our affliction and plead our cause and redeem us for thy name's sake. Heal us, Lord our God, of the pain of our heart. Remove from us sorrow and grief and raise up healing for our wounds. Bless this year for us, Lord our God, and cause all its produce to prosper. Bring quickly the year of our final redemption, and give dew and rain to the land, and satisfy the world from the treasures of your goodness, and bless the work of our hands. Proclaim our liberation with a great trumpet, and raise a banner to gather together our dispersed. Restore our judges as in former time, and our counselors as in the beginning, and reign over us, you alone. And for apostates let there be no hope, and may the insolent kingdom be quickly uprooted in our days. May your mercies be showered over righteous proselytes, and give us a rich reward together with those who do you pleasure. Be merciful, Lord our God, with your great mercies, to Israel your people, and to Jerusalem your city, and to Zion the dwelling place of the glory, and to your temple and your inhabitants, and to the kingship of the house of David, your righteous Messiah. Hear, Lord our God, the voice of our prayer, and be merciful to us, for you are a gracious and merciful God. Be pleased, Lord our God, and dwell in Zion, and may your servants serve you in Jerusalem. We praise you, Lord our God, and the God of our fathers, on account of all the goodness and grace and mercies which you have granted to us, and have done to us and our fathers before us. And if we say our feet are slipping, thy grace, O Lord, succors us. Bring thy peace over Israel, thy people, and over your city and over your inheritance, and bless all of us together. So what do you reckon?
Well, the only thing you wouldn't say Israel all the time.
Yeah, so if we change that to the people of God, but the idea that, and it's more tied to the story of the Old Testament, but this is Second Temple, so not surprisingly. But yeah, it's the focus is on God's grace, His mercy, our need for forgiveness. There's certainly no arrogance there about you owe us. You know, we kept Torah, you better do this, or anything like that. I mean, it's a very, and I think as you go through, do you hear echoes of the Lord's Prayer in there? And that really, I don't think, should be surprising in that these are the prayers of Jesus, and when he pulls it together, you get a kind of similar kind of thing. So, I mean, he took 18 and turned it into just, 8 lines or whatever. But it's a very similar kind of heart to it, I think. And again, thinking of Judaism as works-based religion, something that Jesus is against, works against us in understanding what Jesus is doing and saying in the Gospels. When we become more sympathetic to the environment, then maybe we hear better what Jesus is saying. Because it's easy if we always assume that Jesus is speaking against, people who are trying to earn their way to heaven. We don't actually hear what he is saying to us, and if we think that the Jewish people are just caught up in minutiae of the Torah for the sake of earning their way to heaven, we don't understand again the challenge to us in terms of how we are to respond to God and His calling. Now, you might come from a different church background, different church experience, and it might not be such an issue for you. But for me, as growing up, it seemed like that faithfulness to God, holiness, living a life of in response to God was an optional extra. You could get saved, and then you could choose to be a disciple type if you were so inclined, but it really wasn't part of the relationship. But I think as we realize that Jesus isn't fighting works righteousness, that we start then to maybe say, well, he's calling us to what? Bear fruit, worthy of repentance. How do we live that life? And it's possible to live faithfully for God, not out of a desire to earn something, but just as a response of thankfulness to what God has done for us. So I think it encourages us to engage a little differently with some of the things that we're reading in the Gospels. So let me flip back to so I guess in some ways, and this is more in terms of getting ready for next week and understanding some of the disputes that were going on. By and large, most of the people didn't have enough space in their life to worry about getting caught up in religion. I think they lived faithfully as they could, but they were too poor to worry about arguments. To be a Pharisee or an Essene or a priest, Sadducee, they're very small elements within it. Most people fall into common Judaism, and then certain smaller groups have time or resources or opportunity to get more caught up in it. What we see in the New Testament is basically Jesus talking to the common people rather than Jesus engaged in... we don't find Essenes in the New Testament because they're actually in the desert. They're not talking to anyone. And Jesus doesn't go out looking for them. He's just dealing with the common people. You don't find Jesus interacting much with priests and high priests and Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and stuff because they're in Jerusalem at the center of power, and Jesus doesn't get there till the end, and when he gets there they deal with the problem. What you get is Jesus speaking to the common people by and large, and that's why he's having his arguments with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are also talking to the common people, and they're just disagreeing on what the common people need to do. But we'll explore that in a bit more detail next week. But Jesus doesn't need to teach the common people, who Yahweh is, or he doesn't need to, teach them to abandon legalism or whatever. He's just calling them to be the people of God, to live as God's children. Now, I want to say that by and large, synagogues are not churches. I haven't said, the temple is not a cathedral. A cathedral, for all its bigness and magnificence, is actually built so that people can gather to worship. But the Jerusalem temple is not a place of gathering to worship. Only the priests are carrying out the sacrifices and stuff. So we don't take our understanding of church and cathedral and apply it to temple. We certainly don't take our current experience of church and apply it to synagogue. Synagogue in the first century was much more a community center. It was the place where they did their business. And so if there were discussions to be had, they would come to the community center and do it. On Sabbath, the community center would be given over to study of Torah. During the week, maybe there were times where children were being taught Torah or the stories of Torah. But synagogues were community centers. And because, again, God hadn't moved out there was no place in a synagogue. He says, I'm trying to think of the furniture in a synagogue. There's no place in the synagogue for God. I mean, there's no Holy of Holies. There's a place for the Torah to be kept. I mean, it's an expensive, precious thing. There's a seat of Moses where the teacher would teach from. But by and large, there's no sacrifices being done. There's no holy of holies in a synagogue. It's a community center. This is part of the discussion we're having here because we've got a building, Safe Center Community, which is a kind of community center, and we've got a sanctuary, which is with its churchy kind of bit. And how do you balance church within a community center? Well, it's kind of the discussion of the synagogue from the first century, a community center with a religious component at different times during the week. But it was an opportunity for the community, the Jewish community, to gather. And some Gentiles, non-Jews, could go to synagogue. Why? Because it didn't matter, they were impure because it's not the temple. There's a sign in the temple that says, I should have written it down. The sign says, if you're a Gentile, if you're not Jewish, and you come past this point, it's not our fault, we kill you. This is your warning. Don't go past it. Stay alive. But if you do go past it, well, we're not to be held responsible. And the Romans, by and large, accepted that that was the rules, and by and large, they would allow the Jewish crowds to act as a.
I found the synagogue particularly fascinating when we were out there. I think I mentioned it before in church, but I found the decoration of these synagogues with like signs of the zodiac and Greek gods. That was like the most visual thing to me of the fact that it wasn't Holy of Holies, it wasn't a church, it was actually taking on some of the life that was going on around them in the community. Yeah,
and part of that is they were 4th century synagogues that we were seeing that had the distinctive flooring and stuff. 1st century synagogues tend to have less survival, and so it's harder to tell. Although I think the one in Magdala had non-Jewish imagery in it, and that was a surprise because that's
the one that's more recently found.
Yes, yeah, and it was a surprise because it was recently found, and up till then you would have said that the 1st century maybe didn't have any of that, but even in the 1st century,
it was quite likely that Jesus would have
gone to, yeah,
for sure.
yeah. So their experience of being a group together isn't in the same way of church, because they're a temple-based religion. And so the Gentiles could come to synagogue, and some of them did, for different reasons, and some perhaps of the reason was because Judaism is a very moral religion, and Greco-Roman religion is very immoral, and so it has an attractiveness to people who want to live a little bit more.
You read of Cornelius supporting
Yes.
the synagogue. Also, I would equate the synagogue. A number of years ago, I was involved in a church being established in a school gymnasium.
Yeah.
And I would liken that to perhaps.
Yeah, I think of it more as like the Greek Orthodox churches. When you have an immigrant population come to a new country, they all kind of gather together, and so the kids get to know each other and stuff. It's a community center that does religion, but it's a community center, and because they're not separating religion and life, it's kind of mixed in together. Now, Cornelius could be a God-fearer, which might mean that he lived somewhat faithfully to Torah, or it might mean that he's a patron of the synagogue. The patron of the synagogue could be a woman, so there's no gender issues there. Everybody's money is welcome. If you were wealthy enough to be patron, then good. And so some pagans would be God-fearers, patrons of synagogues, because they wanted to support the Jewish community in the town because they were business partners or kind of part of the community. So, but because the synagogue is not a holy place, as in like the temple, those kind of rules were less tight. So synagogues could be used as schools, for communal meals, as places to stay, as courts, as places to collect and distribute charity, and for political meetings as well. But worship did take place in first century synagogues, usually on the Sabbath, and it would be to do with prayers and with reading of Torah and the prophets, and learning about what that meant. Synagogues were managed by community leaders, not Pharisees. Pharisees are not the leaders of the synagogue. Priests are not the leaders of the synagogues, they're community things, and so community leaders would be leaders of it. So it's not Rabbinic Judaism brought into the Second Temple period. It's a Second Temple experience that with time becomes the Rabbinic Judaism, where the rabbis are responsible for the synagogues. Most first century synagogues don't have particularly Jewish features. Like the one way to identify a synagogue is the Torah shrine, where the Torah is embedded in the walls. But in first century, sometimes that's hard to find because it may not have yet been the place where they kept the Torah. Later on, there's a kind of religious framework to it. Some synagogues are orientated towards Jerusalem, so some kind of connection there. But by and large, it's a community center. But as I've already said, they're not big enough to take the whole community. It's not like everybody was going to synagogue to study Torah on Sabbath. And the requirement for prayer in a Jewish gathering is 10 males. And if in a town of thousands or whatever, 10 is your minimum number, I'm suggesting that most people aren't going to prayers on morning prayers or evening prayers. It's just some who are doing that. But they're not less, but the people who don't go to prayers are no less Jewish than the people who do go to prayers. All right, just then finishing. Jesus was positive about the temple. It's my Father's house. It's a house of prayer. It's a place for prayer and worship. It's a place of teaching. But he's also negative. He cleanses the temple, which is an act of judgment. He's accused of speaking against the temple, and he certainly identifies himself with the temple. So he's situated within common Judaism, but like other groups within that, he's got critiques of how the practice is going. He's positive about Torah. We've already mentioned Matthew 5. Not an iota or a dot will pass from the law until it is accomplished. The temptation stories, Jesus answers with a word from Torah. Jesus, as a boy in the temple, has studied Torah. So there's certainly positive there. But he's also negative towards some of the oral tradition and practice of the Pharisees. And even when in the Sermon on the Mount, and when he says, you have heard, and he tends to be quoting Torah scripture there, but also giving a broader or deeper or more challenging interpretation of it. So, pardon? Yes, yeah, or the harder heart. I mean, don't murder, don't hate. He gets so Jesus is toughening it in a sense, because most of us can get away with not murdering. Don't put your hand up if that doesn't apply to you. We don't. But most of us don't murder. But when it comes to hate, I mean that's a harder thing. Only half of us would be guilty of that. Ritual purity. The Gospels aren't particularly sensitive to purity because most of the time it doesn't apply. There's a little bit of discussion over whether or not Jesus is doing some of the Pharisaic practices, but it gets around the issue of how you interpret meals. If meals are, if you're seeing them as temple meals, then you have to be more pure. But if you just see them as regular meals, then what's it matter? But we can't. Oh, I should. This has been mentioned in church a few times. But the difference, the key difference with Jesus' approach to purity is the direction in which it moves. So the classic approach to purity in a temple context is you try and keep impurity away. And so if a person is impure, you push them away because you don't want to contaminate the Holy of Holies. So that it's assumed that impurity flows down into purity and makes it impure. Whereas Jesus' approach seems to be more the other way, where Jesus assumes that purity will run down and purify the impure. And so, again, that gets back a little to Jesus seeing himself as the temple, the place where God is present and gives forgiveness and healing. So the purity moves in a different direction. And so next week when we talk about sinners, it's a basic conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, and it's around whether or not, if you're a sinner, will you make me impure by me hanging out with you, or will I make you pure? Or the other way around. Will David make me pure if he hangs out with me, or will I make him impure by my presence? So that's part of the basic debate there. Jesus is positive towards the Sabbath, about honoring the Sabbath, although he wants to honor it, but doesn't accept the same boundaries on it. But Jesus is involved in a redefinition of who the people of God is. That's part of the thing. Whether or not you include the excluded, the marginalized. But we'll talk about that more next week. And so let me finish in the last 30 seconds with whether or not Christianity, Jesus, is political. Should Christians, does the gospel cover politics? Or should we separate church and state? And the easy answer to that, because Baptists are very much into the separation of church and state, the easy answer to that is in Second Temple Judaism, nobody could even imagine not having the two things together, because there is no religion and politics and economy and social system. It's all one. It's all integrated. And so how you approach your religion is the same as how you approach your politics and your economy and stuff, because it's all one big thing. And so when you ask the question, is Jesus political? The answer is yes. What he had to say affected how the country would behave, and the whole thing would behave. But if by politics you mean party politics, well, that didn't exist in the first century either. And no, Jesus isn't. Jesus wouldn't be voting for any of our parties. I don't think. And if he tried to run for office, I'm sure he would be crucified. Yeah, not even that one. But the first century doesn't distinguish. Jesus expected following God to have implications for how you dealt with the Romans, for how you dealt with your money, for how you dealt with your neighbor. All aspects of life is caught up in that, and you can't just separate a Sunday life from a Monday life. There is just life. Yeah. It's just life. Yeah.
The difference is that Israel was meant to be a theocracy.
Yes, but even a theocracy, you've got kings, priests, and prophets all in there as they seek.
With the politics side.
Yeah.
Whereas the Lord was supposed to be the Prime Minister, the principal, the President, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the theory,
Yeah, although, certainly, though, as the church engaged with the Roman Empire, it wasn't necessarily seen that the church wanted to take over from Caesar, but they knew the answer, who was Lord. Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. And that may be the beginning of Sunday morning sermon, but I will leave that till Sunday morning. So thank you again for your participation. Next week we'll be focusing more on the groups within Judaism. So we'll be looking at the Essenes, the Sadducees, but particularly we'll be looking at Pharisees and sinners. And most of you will fit somewhere into one of them.